Okay, so my goal here is really for this part for everyone to come away with solutions. And what will you do differently coming out of this session in terms of actually taking the research and actually turning it back into your practice, while also taking the practice and actually having that influence your research. I actually wanted to go back to the questions, but I guess we, sorry, can I go back to the slides? I want to go back to the questions, yeah, all right. So going to be asking some questions and then open to the panel, open to the audience. Let's have mixed questions, answers, solutions. You know, let's just mix it up. And as I said, yeah, thank you.
Which one do you want? This one?
I want to go back to near the beginning. So, yeah, to the questions here. All right, thank you. I appreciate it. So one question, again, for the panel, for the audience. So research community has their own world, their own kind of cycles and ways that they do things. And, of course, builders, architects, facility managers have their own sort of world. Again, how do we get those to coordinate better so that, you know, again, that the research is feeding the practice is feeding the research? You know, for example, I think Charlene mentioned research takes years and years to actually get out there. How can that fit better with the, you know, the architectural, the building cycle, the design cycle? Thoughts? Or in the audience? Yeah, we get the mic. Yeah.
I'll speak to that because that's exactly what the Center for the Built Environment does, and it's a great model, but I know that it's not necessarily reproducible, but there's elements of it that can be much more easily. And it's been really amazing when we get industry and researchers around the table regularly, because the researchers have had to learn to figure out how to phase our research into shorter time periods because practitioners need answers quickly, and practitioners have learned how to ask questions differently and maybe be a little bit more patient and somewhere meet in the middle. But what also happens is that the industry members come together in a non-competitive forum. We find that, you know, we have architects, engineers, builders, manufacturers, government agencies, utilities, building owners, and they say that often the only time they come and talk to each other is on a project-by-project basis, and they've got really short timelines. There's sort of a competitive feeling when they talk to people of their own kind. And so it's not only been good to bridge those two disciplines, but it's changed the way the different disciplines of practice have come together as well. And so I think anything we can do in either kind of shorter and more frequent ways to get researchers and practitioners at a table talking about things that they care about, not on just a project-by-project basis, is really powerful.
Thank you, Gail.
I was just going to say, Ed, I mean, I think you're creating a great environment. I think the more and more of those type of hubs where researchers can come together with practitioners, I think the better discussions we're going to have, at least kind of learning what researchers might already know that can get out there and get translated. I do think, and I think on an earlier session they were talking about researchers need to get into this like instant framework. I do think in this conversation we have to appreciate some of our funding cycles are there for a reason. There is a great value to rigorous research, and there's you know, appreciation. So the evidence, we are trying to improve the strength of it. So when decisions are made, that there's quality evidence informing it. So I do think there's room for, you know, Rachel explained the rapid response mechanism that NIH is supporting, and other ways that we can get the information out. But I don't want us to kind of get this instantaneous idea that research should always be done quick and not kind of appreciate.
Maybe half of our research funding comes from that, you know, avenue, and half comes from the more traditional grants with a much longer time scale. Because you're absolutely right, not everything could get quick answers. But what we try to do, even with the longer term research agendas, is to break it into phases so that you don't wait till the end of 5 years to get any answers at all. but you try to communicate findings along the way.
Whitney, yeah.
Yeah, so I'll just offer up. So I work at Canon Design, and I lead research for the firm. And I think this is a really critical question that we should have around how to translate research to practice, something I battle with every day, and I really appreciate this panel. One thing I ask myself a lot is how do I take what I'm trained in, which is more the biomedical research process from public health, and then apply it to the design process. And I think what I've come up with is that they are very complementary in some ways, but also fundamentally different. And I think that sometimes we try to fit the two together in ways of like continuing to argue that our way is kind of the way that we do it. But the truth of the matter is that it's a very special opportunity to rethink about health in the design process. In fact, I'd argue that we need to have a lot more conversations about when it comes to design and practice, which is different. So research and practice is different than academic research. And I do wear that kind of hat as well. But that kind of funding cycle, the type of research, the rigor, what Center for Built Environment is doing, that needs to remain very much in that cycle, I think. When we're talking about research and practice, it's a different baby. I'm running 5-7-year studies right now, and it is a huge challenge because at the end of the day, we have results, and that client has moved on. The design teams have moved on, and who and where we publish that and how it's used really is hard. So I guess one thing I would argue, and something that I think everyone should look at here, is the process. We talk a lot about outcomes. We talk a lot about features in the environment. But a lot of times those features can change real time. By the time that we're done with a project, new innovations come online, new technologies come online. So I can do research to demonstrate that that's a really effective and efficient way to help, I don't know, autonomy of the user and empower them, right? But at the end of the day, new technologies come online and we're already like out of the gates in the next project. So I would argue for process. I'd argue that we need to look a lot more at health professionals being part of design teams. So that means that there will be a health advisor that sits on the team from the very, very beginning, and their job is to inform you about health issues. And I think that we should utilize designers to say, what are we best at? Design thinking, let's think outside the box, let's try to create, versus kind of coming from two different fields and trying to make that happen, and not always paralleling and thinking about synergistic ways that our efforts can work together.
On the design side, I think one of the really big challenges is there's so much going on and so much new all the time that we just want to do it all, and we can't do it all at the same time. So it's very hard, but to think about the trajectory of a practice over a series of projects over maybe 5 to 10 years is really, I think, the way that we need to think about applying research in a smarter way, which says, okay, where do we want to be with this in 10 years? What are the maybe incremental steps that we can take so that we learn this on this project, and then we'll get to the next step on the next project, and it builds up over time. But you can't do it all on the one project where maybe the start to finish cycle might be 3 or 3.5 years to move in. So it's an interesting challenge.
Yeah, real quick.
That's right. And any given project that you're providing the research to wants the results for their project. Client A doesn't want to fund the results for the next client.
Right, right. It's a tough thing.
Well, and coming to this as a social scientist that took a turn away from academia into the world of engineers and architects, I would make an argument for all the educators here who work in universities to kind of expand the universe of those people who are going into specific jobs now so that they don't think of these things as separate from what their actual profession is. If you look at the Translating Research into Practice slide I put together, I basically asked the job description of somebody who could do this work is basically they need to be a research and subject matter expert, they need to be intimate audience knowledge of multiple audiences, and they need to express clear writing and healthy doses of graphic design. Is that one person, really? No, it isn't. So what we need is to actually open up the world of, say, this is what we need in order to design well. People who can think across and talk to other experts on teams that work like that. And if we set the model backwards, high school, junior high even, and say these are kind of skills that if you're good, if you like solving big problems, here's something you've never thought about addressing, I think that would be helpful.
I think Esther is next.
To add on to that,
Esther's got it.
however, it's possible, and many firms do set aside a portion of their fees for research that are more of like a professional development and firm development avenue. But it's a small portion, and it's not enough to address all of the hurdles in the research that we need today. but it is happening in some capacity, and you working for a professional firm is evidence of that.
So I think this is an issue that we've grappled with in biomedical research for a very, very long time, and I would relate this to the comparison between basic research and clinical practice. And there is a continuum between basic research carrying on at its pace, doing the rigorous research in the way researchers think, to clinical research, to translation into practice. And it's not something that you can figure out in one split second, but there is a model that exists. So rather than saying we need to take research and translate it into design practice, let's think about taking different kinds of research and translating it ultimately into practice. And I think it does require, when you create these interdisciplinary teams, you need to become an informed consumer of the other person's field. When I did this here at NIH, I was bringing neuroscientists and immunologists together, and at first the neuroscientist said, well, we can't learn how to do radioimmunoassays, and the immunologist said, we can't do brain cutting. But we're not asking you to do that. We're not asking the health expert to build a building, or the building expert or the design expert to cure heart disease. What we are asking is for people in interdisciplinary teams to come together in interdisciplinary groups like this, become informed consumers of the kinds of questions we can ask, the timelines with which we can answer them, what is rigorous data. I could go on and on, but there are multiple, actually, Jim, you said that we do need to develop a strategy of how to do this. And we can't do it standing on one foot in 30 seconds. But I would say that there is a model of how this is done, taking basic research and basic science all the way into clinical practice, and maybe that can inform the process.
Thank you. Did you want to? Okay.
So it seems to me that there's a big disconnect in part between practice and research, and partially because there's not very much post-occupancy evaluation as part of architectural services. So typically, you build your building, you turn it over to your client, you tweak it a little bit depending on the complexity of the building, and then you go to the next building and call it a day. And I know there's a huge opportunity for architects in post-occupancy evaluation, but I think there's also kind of a cop-out for architects to say, oh, well, the owner's not going to pay me for it, so I'm not going to think about that. I'm just going to go to the next project. So, Margaret, especially for you, how do you take this? I'm not trying to call you out, I'm sorry. How do you take that, learning, the lessons learned from that VA project in New Orleans, and not only continue the research with the client and make sure that it's as successful as you would like it to be, but also communicate that to other design teams within your firm, whether they're on the healthcare team or not?
Well, first of all, since it's still in construction, I get a free pass on whether we have or haven't done it yet. But we will definitely be going back to that to try to determine how those strategies actually worked and whether they're effective for the occupants. We put a lot of work into that project ahead of time in that research, so we absolutely are going to follow through. The challenge, I think, is more in projects that are a little quicker, that didn't have the time or fee to do that research to start with. So those are a little bit more challenging, and we completely acknowledge that it's really the critical closing of the loop that we need to do more often than not only to understand how the occupants are working, but also how the building is working, and get both of those things put together. We do a pretty good job of workplace post-occupancy surveys, and we do have a group that's pretty interested in understanding how the workplace strategies are working. So that gets at some of what we're talking about. We're probably a little bit less, shall we say, rigorous or consistent about getting that building information. So it's a pretty interesting thing. We're good at getting the human side and maybe not so much the building side, but they both need to go together.
Well, and I think there's a follow-up to that as well in terms of when you do the post-occupancy and you find that there are challenges with certain aspects of the building that you did reference existing research to, there's maybe a need for more research. So how do those results then come back to the research community to focus more energy and more time on a specific topic, right? And so it's not just the design learning within the firm, but feeding that back through the research process.
And the other thing that you have is any federal builder of space, NREL's building is a great example, is a great place to look for an transparent plan on how they did what they did. The Wynkoop building, which is EPA's leased building in Denver, has been studied more than almost any other modern building that I know of, aside from the Empire State Building. That's a great place to look at lessons. And increasingly, we're asking the question about occupant behavior in those studies, not just about building systems.
Cool. I want to hear not just questions, but also, what are you all doing to actually to break this gap, to overcome this gap between research and practice? Go ahead, Jonathan.
I don't know if this is going to respond to that. Well, first, I want to correct something that Chris said about the buildings off of 95. The bad ones you saw were not designed by architects. On another note, I went to address how is research being translated into practice, and to connect a bit to the last panel as well, because we were talking about researchers talking to design professionals, but the thing that's missing, and you're wondering about successful programs, there are programs like the Center for Health and Environmental Justice Green Flags program that when kids go to school, they learn about how schools are cleaned, that they learn about the materials in the school, and when they go home, they educate their parents. And I don't know if it was really addressed in the elementary school near Charlottesville, but when those kids go home and the parents serve them the stuff that they used to get for lunch in school, they're going to say, you know what, we learned about this in school, and we don't like this anymore, and please change the way that you're doing this. And so I would say that all this fantastic research is being done, but I want to also connect to Brian this morning, who talked about doctors washing their hands. It's still a problem today for nurses to feel empowered to tell the doctors to wash their hands when they walk into the rooms. The big problem is in the communities. Communities are not empowered. I was involved with a program to improve the DC public schools and the condition of things like the restrooms. If I'd had a kid in the school, I'd be down with a torch at City Hall, like a carbon neutral torch, of course. But it's maybe it's easier for those of us who are, I assume, more educated and fairly prosperous, relatively prosperous, to feel empowered to go communicate these needs to people. So I think that's one thing that we're all aiming at a certain level, particularly in the area of designers. But we have to think about how do we get into the community, how do we get them to begin to ask these questions as well.
Any comments? Let's get to the other side. Get that to Bill. Yeah. Who had their hands up? You. And then I know we had one afterwards.
Bill Brout from NIH. Give a parallel for what we've done with building information modeling. After watching it for several years, in 2006, following the GSA's mandate letter, we tepidly stepped forward to explore this with committees, and finally got a letter out asking each of our centers, which NASA centers operate very independently, to find pilot project. However, they wanted to find a pilot project. Very little had come back in terms of progress until this year, when an individual decided I'll write a white paper on it and got these centers to fess up to what they had done. I read the draft of that last month, and I was amazed at how much has actually been accomplished. There needed to be some direction from a higher level management to go forward, provide some backing, but then people took off without no money, just it's good to go. And they found their way, and I think that's a good way to do things.
I wonder if part of it is taking the research and packaging it. So you package it in bin, you package it in labels, you package it in lead. So is there that intermediary kind of step that is necessary? Is there another question? Yeah.
I'm
I think one of the issues we're dealing with here is the issue of uncertainty. So academics and researchers have a certain way of dealing with uncertainty. Practitioners have a way of dealing with uncertainty. Engineers have a way of dealing with uncertainty. And it gets very messy when nobody wants to take the risk of saying you do X, Y, and Z, and this will absolutely lead to the X outcome. So there are ways that are out there for us to categorize what we're pretty certain about, what we're not quite as certain about, what we really don't know about yet. I mean, Center for Health Design does some great, research saying this is rigorous according to our research. This has got a lot of promise, but doesn't have enough case studies yet. This is still new areas. So I think we need to look at some of those models and find really creative ways to deal with uncertainty that still allows us to move forward, make mistakes, not too costly mistakes, but have that cycle. So I think, all of us need to be okay to say we're not sure, and let's still move forward somehow.
That's a great comment. There's an example many people in the room might know, which is the decision to get married or not. Do you know for sure that you found the one? Or do you know sure enough to know that you found the person that you're going to commit to actually be in a relationship with to problem solve over time? Now, I was playing around with this analogy of a marriage and a wedding earlier, because I think constructing a building without attending to the health of the people inside or the operations and maintenance is basically paying all your attention to the wedding and none to the marriage. And that's a mistake, right? So when it comes to action, what does this say? We are in position to make decisions all the time based on the information that we have from multiple different feedback mechanisms, whether it's being in love or knowing that this is somebody I can raise children with or whatnot, if we continue with the marriage example. You don't need to be certain. You need to be certain enough to commit. And my idea about why a wedding is not a bad idea is because a wedding actually signifies public commitment in front of the world that you're going to try to work things out over time, right? So if we think about the linkage, forget about the fact that the budget doesn't let us do operation and maintenance and building a building all at the same time these days. That should change, by the way. That's me, not GSA, saying that. But if we look at the wedding as building a building as a commitment, and we can build in what it means to be committed to the healthy, green, sustainable operation of that over time as what building means, then it should actually lead to more healthy marriages and less divorces when it comes to the health of buildings over time.
I think we can take that analogy in all kinds of directions. Yeah.
It hits a regulated field as well. I was just going to comment particularly to the uncertainty comment and kind of looking at evidence that Katrina, I think we could point her out in the room. The Dietary Guidelines, which is really puts out what is healthy, right, for 2 and above for the healthy population, is in process right now for 2015, and they very much have a rigorous way of looking at the available evidence, using evidence-based systematic reviews. And they are putting forth, I think, pretty innovative things in the built environment space, and so this should be forthcoming, I think, in the next year or so. So this is really, I think the strongest time the nutrition community has really intersected with you guys and put out more questions, I think, than answers. But this is really, I think, a promising opportunity to start seeing those intersections. So again, I would look to that report and others that maybe will come forth with physical activity and start seeing both what we've translated from the research into practice, but also the research gaps and opportunities, because that's where we both need practice and researchers to address those things.
Claire?
Just with respect to the first question up there, I really do want building professionals to show some proficiency on how children are different, to understand it and demonstrate some proficiency in that field. So this is a little bit like Children's Environmental Health 101. And I think as part of that, I think there needs to be a recognition of how people who are designing schools are going to interact with their client. The client doesn't necessarily have a lot of money. The client might be difficult. The client is not going to take care of the building. So in some ways, you need sort of like child-resistant caps on prescription drugs. You need child-resistant buildings in schools or whatever. That said, I don't think I'm very cautious on the research side. I know we need more research. We know we need more surveillance and more metrics. On the other hand, we also know how to prevent problems. And exercising prevention now makes a huge amount of sense.
I was laughing at your idea of child-proof buildings because I was working on a research project with the Army, and they use the term soldier-proof buildings. So, and I understand marine-proof is actually a higher standard. So,
a potential natural ally for, I was thinking about a federal corollary to the schools issue, is child care centers, which the federal government does a great deal of, and Jonathan, I think, was involved in that at some point. I think there's room for us to work together there, especially in making it clearer how children are different than adults. And I don't know if we've done enough of that yet.
Excuse me, that's a little loud. This is Nick again, and just to suggest a part of the solution, we have a client which is just, they're part of one of the leading healthcare systems in the world, and the chief quality officer there, and she just says, if you don't build a mock-up and experiment with it during programming and schematic design and earlier, then shame on you. You're stupid. And it's so compelling and so wonderful in so many ways, but it's also because we've educated her what you can do with a mock-up. It's that we've taken some of our existing processes and that we do during design delivery and just beef them up and provide a certain degree and level of research instrumentation to go with it. It's also an issue of incentivizing and recognizing that the effort was made despite the outcome. I am often frustrated with this, and I'm listening to a lot of this, and I can't really identify with it. In EDRA, I serve with a lot of academics, and trying to understand their pace and rate of research, even when it's a building research council kind of arrangement at like a Berkeley or whatever, where they consult one off or what have you, or the Pebble projects or whatnot. It gets a little bogged down. And so if there was more incentive around the process, and recognition of a process that may not necessarily lead to a generalizable solution, but led to implementation of research on a building project that could be part of converging evidence, then maybe is the best we can do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, we heard a couple of solutions in terms of like the CBE example, and hopefully we can close with a few more. But Kirsten, I think last question. Tool.
And I particularly the idea of nuggets, because we have so much information that's coming at us. We can store the little pieces. The challenge too, when we talk about trying to get better, healthier buildings or more well-being in buildings, where it's actually being done is by the interior designers, not necessarily core and shell architects of buildings, and it's being done in existing buildings. So the interior designers and actually the facility managers are people that really, really need to be part of this conversation. They need information in nuggets. So the question is, how can we take this information and can we collaboratively share it out and do something? Can there be like a Pinterest for well-being in buildings, right? So we can move away from all the silos. We can collaboratively crowdsource all this great data that people can then go look at it when they need to, when they're working on it. It could be a particular one like, what is it about, designing for children, right? That somebody who's working on that can actually go and see that at that point in time. But how do we elevate the crowd? How do we recognize that, that we really need to deliver the information in nuggets and make it timely?
And thank you for that. There is actually a health and well-being Pinterest page. On the SF Tool Pinterest account, we have a Pinterest account for SF Tool as well as Twitter and Facebook. Why did we do that? It's because if people are going to learn through pictures these days, then we want them to learn through pictures attached to the content we've developed. And since our tool is so picture-based and graphic, we figured why not create a Pinterest page and figure that out? Well, we also, don't poo-poo Pinterest, it's not just where you find recipes, right? If you're going to go to Pinterest, you can actually, if you click on the picture itself, it takes you to the page that picture came from, which means if any of you have projects that you've built and case studies that you've put together and you link a page, you can actually bring people directly to the case studies that are otherwise hidden, which is a great way of putting research into practice.
And on that note, I think,
Can we cut into one more? One more question?
well, I think we had a couple more comments on the panel. Yeah.
Oh, mine was just facetious. Did you pay Kirsten to say that? No.
I was just going to end, at least the idea behind this was to really be more solution-oriented. And really, I feel this group is very solution-oriented in terms of health and buildings. I think it's good for us to know what research is already there and can be nuggetized, and also to know what the research needs are of the community and how we can interface a little bit better. I think we're all kind of hearing each other, but I think the next step is kind of acting on these things.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to close, and just think about, in terms of research into practice, I like Michael's analogy of a marriage, and just think about how we can work on this marriage and improve it and make it succeed. So, thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Sorry.
All right, so take a stretch break for just 10 seconds, and then we're going to come right back and finish this thing off. All right. All right, enough stretching, enough stretching. This is no joke. We got to get to the finish line here. All right, so here we go. So this is going to be our closing round. And so before we get into the closing round, we want to make sure that we appreciate the folks who made all of this possible today. So could have paused for a second while everyone gets back into action. All right, so a couple of folks who have been important. And Charles Bloomberg is one of those people. Charles, I'm thanking you for helping us get here. So all right, so we have a few others who are important. Clearly, Kenny is important. So a couple other people who were important. So I'm going to do a few, and then Ashley's going to do a few. Dave Marcus, who many of you guys had the privilege of meeting and has kept us on track. Dave has done an incredible amount of hard work to get this on track. Amber, who is somewhere around here, also did the same. And of course, Ashley White, our senior research fellow who helped us with the whole program today, has been really instrumental in doing all this. And the last one, Charlene is in, okay. So this is officially Charlene's event, in case you were wondering that. So each of the Google Senior Research Fellows had to do an event as part of their status with us. And so this is officially Charlene. So thank you for that. And so, one last one for me, Jim. Thank you for being a co-host and a partner with us. Who did I forget?
Just a couple other people. We were also working in conjunction with AIA for this event, so both Matt Welker and Marianne Lazarus on behalf of AIA, and also Michelle Coley, who is with NIH, who helped us a lot on the logistics end of things here.
All right, so roar thing? All right, we're going to roar. Okay, so here's how this works. So this is going to be the wrap-up round. So given that this group is still too big to do like just a round the room, and this is where those cards come in handy, right? So we're going to close the day with the for all of our. So what we're asking you to do is for the benefit of everyone here, is to provide two remarks. One is recognition for something you heard today that made an impact on you. And yes, I realize it's a little cliched, but we're looking for a tweet-length comment, right? Like, not like a rehash of their entire talk, not why it moved you, but, succinct, right? And then something you're taking with you that you might offer as a conclusion back to the group, something that can send us forward till we get together hopefully again next year. So I was struggling to provide an example for you, and so I wanted to see if I could do that. And so I want to offer two things. One is, first is my recognition. I was looking through my notebook, and you guys can tell I like to scribble my notes here. And something I hadn't thought of until we got here, I think it was Jim, actually. I think in your comment, and I may be misattributing, I'm sorry if I do that, but Jim made the observation about the National Physical Activity Plan and the fact that the nature of the built environment was not yet part of that plan. That, A, was something I hadn't thought about, be something that seemed actionable, and per the conversations actually Esther was talking about as well, we can probably do something about that. So Jim, I thought that stuck with me as something tangible. And I want to, and my reflection for things that stick with me as things going forward, I want to take us all the way back to Brian Civic this morning. And my observation about Brian Civic was that he had this moment, and he talked about how the healthcare industry and the industry that HHS serves is slow, structurally risk-averse, and opaque with respect to cost and outcomes. It's like, yeah, we resemble that remark. And I got to say, I take some inspiration that he, in his tenure at HHS and his colleagues, have made that tangibly better. So if we can internalize the fact that we resemble that remark and learn something from his experience making it better in this massive healthcare bureaucracy, I think that we can learn from that. All right, that's my contribution. So, all right, so if folks want to come up or pass the mic or however we want to do, that's not a microphone. Geez, that's the largest laser I've ever seen. Like what? Okay. My son was like that.
Okay, so earlier today, Gail Brager said that we need to be careful when assigning definitive causality. So, of course, considering complex environments, it takes a lot to promise that a particular outcome has resulted from a particular intervention, and to be sure that that intervention outcome translates to all other environments. And taking that then one step forward off what Michael Bloom just said is, I'd like to know how we can prove that our marriage has been successful, more than just, we didn't get divorced from our building or whatever.
So we can either pass the mic, or you're welcome to come up to the podium to do your card, whichever you prefer. Okay. Who wants to go next? What do you mean? You're going to go next? Yeah. I'm going to start calling on people who have strong opinions.
So, we meet again. I'm glad Whitney's still here. And the reason is because, and of course, Chris as well, because I kind of reflect back to when USGBC decided that they were going to go healthy in the way that we've provided some kind of model for you, hopefully. And it was a conversation that we were having at the close of that ceremony, and it stuck in my mind because it was, and you know what's coming, it was of experience. So we had the experience when I first came here a long time ago that had to do with design research. And we were trying to understand what kind of environment we needed to create for a radiology or oncology center. And we went through a long debate. It was the architect, and it was behavioral and social scientists and interior designers, which basically made up the team. What Whitney said to Matt at that, when he was talking about his research and about how he has to go back and he has to think about how he's going to reset his research. Remember that? And you remember your answer? It was that we need to create a team. And we've heard this around pretty much today. It can't be done by one person. It can't be done by one discipline. And it's not just a matter of vocabulary or interpretation, but working together. And I think, I'm not saying that this is the solution, but it's something else that we did a long time ago, and it worked, and yet it got lost. And do you have any further thoughts on that, since you put that to him? Because what you asked, when you said to Matt was, maybe you don't want to just go back and rethink how you're going to do your statement, or your design statement, or your research statement as you go to do your research on a particular problem. But you pull together a team of folks who all have a vested interest in trying to solve the design problem. Researchers there need the input, everybody needs the input from everybody else. Have you had any additional thoughts now that I've carried it another further, or anybody else for that matter, because it's a way to do it. That's all.
Thanks, Charles. Sure. Well, I think that, it's always an honor to be in a room with people that are passionate, have been in this cause. And, I think even standing next to Angela, we've been doing this work for a while, and all of our mentors are in this room. So we thank you for that. And I think the comment that I made, I remember that day, was that, there was a struggle early on because the designers were saying, hi, public health people, we need you. And the public health people were saying, well, we need you designers. We couldn't quite figure out how that would happen without saying, we both need to do a lot more work, a lot more time, and a lot more money, and a lot more research. And there seemed to be some way of saying, how can we make the right thing the easy thing to do? Is there a way to make this something? Is there a way to lean on each other? When I speak to architects in my firm today, it's not, you need to be a health expert. It's you need to know who the health experts are. You need to be engaged in the conversation. You need to be a leader that when someone asks you, you can step up and you can say, I know who to talk to, I understand this well enough, and I'm a leader. And I think this year the acting surgeon general stepped forward, was so passionate to say, designers, you are public health advocates. We need you in this conversation. And I think what Matt was pointing out, and it was an early challenge, was to say, do we all just go back to school and learn about this all again? Because this is kind of overwhelming. I think I can speak about the public health people in the room. The first time I learned about a building, I was so scared. I was like, never asked me to actually design a building. I don't even know where to start. And I can't imagine designers saying, vice versa, where do I even start to begin to understand public health? And the point was, we just need to know each other. We just need to know each other. And the teams and the research, I think, is unique in this field, unlike any other field. And I do think that the grants, if they go forward, should be about collaborative teams, integrated teams. They should be about who you know that you can bring to the table early on to affect the process, the design industry. I think that likewise, we need to be thinking about, in the research realm, if you can't translate it, this industry is moving fast. It's moving fast and it wants answers and it's willing to step up. But I just can't say enough that I think that a huge part of any of these conferences, and I think a lot of people this year, there's probably been 5, 6 new conferences on the scene that just came from nowhere. And you're like, whoa, you're talking about health and design, I'm there. And you see the same people because we are advocates for this. And I think it's unbelievably critical that we know each other, because the biggest resource is that we all came to this together and know each other. And it's not even just listening to the presentations, knowing when to turn to those people. So I would advocate that. I'm honored to be in this room with everyone, and I think that we're part of a much bigger movement. And the biggest thing now that I hear is, we still need to prove, we still need to get out there, but it's tipped. I do believe we've tipped. I believe this last year I could point to 5 different incidents. I don't know if Chris and Charles and Charlene and Esther and all the folks in the room and Gail would say or agree on this, but I think we're starting to tip. We're starting to see this really happening. And the big question I have for this group is, what's our message?
Make a follow-up comment on that topic. I was thinking about the Innovation Lab as something that really stuck out to me as something really interesting, that you had this residency and you tried to create innovation. And I think that might be a good model for us. And the second thing is, there's some recent health grants in Colorado that have been put out to link health specifically with the built environment. And they're extremely prescriptive. And part of their fundamental prescription was build a coalition, do an assessment, figure out how you're going to implement, and develop a communications campaign, as well as grassroots engagement. I don't think that's a terrible model for us to be forced, possibly through grant funding, because everybody's already busy, to work in such a way that we are forced to build some kind of coalition, some kind of innovation lab residency, and then have a systematic outcome like that. There might be one model or ways of us to think about how to work together.
Actually going to take the corner of the room here, and we're going to take over the whole meeting. So I agree with these points, and Brian Civic's example of the Idea Lab, I think, was what stuck with me most. And also in my experience in working across the table with design professionals. In research, we tend to lionize the hypothesis-driven approach, which takes a long time and which requires that you need a hypothesis. It may be faster, more efficient to sit across the table and understand, for the researcher to understand in an iterative way what the design professionals need and how our tools can help you design professionals answer those questions. That's a different way of doing research, and I think it fits more with Brian Civic's Ideas Lab approach. It makes you more agile, and it may be an approach that's important. And the other thing that stuck with me was what Jim said, that we need a plan, a strategic plan to get this out into all the target audiences, all the stakeholders. And somebody said along the way that you need different, might have been Michael Bloom, I'm not sure, that you need different language for different target audiences. It's a political campaign, you know? You need to identify who your stakeholders are, how you speak to them differently, and you need a strategic plan. It can't be haphazard. Welcome to the corner.
This is the corner. I'm Carl Grimes with Hayward Healthy Home out of Monterey, California. How do I get a hold of you guys? That's the question I have. I don't see a structure or a website or a Pinterest or a Twitter account or whatever all that is for me to say, here's a question I have, and put it out to whoever, the group, and then you see it and respond and say, hey, I can help you with this, or here's a study, here's information, here's some experience over here. I think that's the biggest need that I see right now just within this group. Then I'm involved with a number of other organizations in different levels. They're all talking about health and buildings. They have no idea who we are, okay? I bring it up, I mention it and that sort of thing, but it doesn't have meaning to them because they don't have any experience with it. And if there's a way that some of us could then also go to those organizations and say, here's what I need, then they could respond. So that's the SF Tool has some sort of organization. I don't know if that fits or not, but that's kind of what stuck with me. And the need that I see is we need some sort of structure, organization, or platform where we can talk to each other in a dynamic way that it keeps changing. You know, you can't have just one organization and it's always going to work that way. It's going to change and shift all the time.
I know this is like Hyde Park in London. So I'm gonna, we're fomenting revolution here. I think the phrase that stuck with me, which I think any good designer hopefully thinks of, is health will come to us if we follow these principles. And I think that that's the only way that a designer can move forward is, you know, their internal logic. But I think one thing that I got from today, and I've gotten over time from these kinds of meetings, is that even if the health people are talking in one direction, I just learned at Greenbuild what asthmagen means as opposed to like asthma. And it was like such an important idea. It's like, oh, you can develop this later in life if a designer puts something in the building that triggers this. And, you know, so each of us is always going to be learning things, but I think knowing that there's the research community behind us working on this, and what things that we do pick up we can begin to apply, I think is very reassuring. And we're not out there, we need to get out there on a limb anyway, because the designers are the ones that translate these into the built environment. But knowing that there are people out there who are going to back us up, at least sort of incrementally in the way that we can progress, is very important. I think it's very enriching. And even if it's someone in your office who's always used a particular material, and you say, I just learned about this material, they're going to cross it off the list. They don't have to have, the entire list, but that's how, knowing that the discussion and the research is going on, I think makes people more confident in what they do. Is it back in the corner?
I guess this is the corner. I have two thoughts taking away from today. And one of them, and they both relate to me personally, how I've explored and integrated research into my design practice. Oh, I'm Barbara Hewitt, Alexandria, Virginia, Hewitt Davis. Okay, one is we have to be able to speak the same language if we're going to talk to each other. The evidence-based design certification has personally given me that vocabulary. I think it's a great resource and tool for the design profession. It has also allowed our firm, our practice, to take the processes of research and integrate it into the design practice that we already have a process for, such as in programming and post-occupancy review. Those are the two things that design firms have typically applied research to. But now, with having evidence-based design practices and vocabulary, we can integrate that process to be able to speak to the multidisciplines that are so important to having evidence-based design research. Okay, who's next? There you go.
Okay, two things. One, from the technical side, really the comment that, and the data that Meg was providing, Meg Schwartzman, remember Meg, are you still here? Basically, chemicals and materials don't stay put. I think that's, something that's really valuable. We always need to be reminded of that, and that would be actually a great thing to, which is my follow-up, nuggetize the research findings and pin them in the cloud, and of course, tweet about it.
Yeah, nuggetize, I like that word. I think the thing that really opened my eyes the most was from Chris this morning when he used the pharmacy and the health product, because the one thing that I hear constantly is, where's the science? How can you prove this? Because most of indoor air is anecdotal. So we need to move past the anecdotal. We have the evidence. That's the whole translation as we move it out. And I think that's the thing that I, as a researcher, I really want to focus on. How do we move out a lot of this stuff that I've got piles of data. It's time to start moving things into practice. And I like Kirsten's idea about little pieces at a time. And I'm going to focus on that.
Okay, two things. One, I think the Biomimicry Institute's programs are a really good example of this translational ability, where they have biologists that are specially trained to speak a language that is accessible to designers and more lay people. Yeah, and so both their biologist at the design table program and then the website asknature.org are really helpful as sort of examples of that translation of the science into something that's easier to digest for the rest of us. And then the other thing, this is go back to a totally different subject, but an instant translation of the research was the fact that the instant recess and the standing ovations, I don't know, I don't think I saw anybody sleeping today. So I'd say that's pretty instant feedback of success. And even when there's no windows in the room.
Well, this really was an exciting day, too, and I wanted to mention something that wasn't brought up today, but I know that everybody in this field feels this is important, and that is the underlying issue of climate change. There was a new intergovernmental panel presentation to the UN about a month ago, and there's an outstanding TED Talk, if you haven't seen it, by Lord Nicholas Stern, who was the co-author of the most recent report. He gives a very balanced, presents the topic as serious. He gives positive, easy to do, fairly quick result examples of moving ahead against the problem we're facing. And yet he also underlines the urgency of we all need to solve this. And certainly the types of discussions that we've had in this room are moving to that end. And I highly commend to you his TED Talk. Just before that report was presented, there were 400,000 people from a variety of backgrounds marching in the streets of New York City in the People's Climate March. I happened to go because of some encouragement by students from American University. It's one of the most amazing experiences I've ever had in my life. And one of the big groups there were labor unions and people marching for green jobs. So what you're doing is not only important for the prospective building owners, but for the people who are going to work on the buildings as well as the people in the buildings. And I especially wanted to give a shout out to all the people mentioning the fact that children are not miniature adults. I'm a pediatric ophthalmologist by training, and I have my first grandchild, a 5-month-old, which is how Lord Stern ends his talk, with his 2-week-old granddaughter coming up on the stage with his daughter. This is urgent, and the little people get sick at lower levels of toxins than some of us bigger people. And I guess what I wanted to add to the day was, please do careful research, but do it as quickly as you can, and build the green products as quickly as you can, because the world needs it. Yep. Oh. Well, the reason I'm here is because Charlene and Whitney and Charles and I and a couple other, Vivian, met at a federal green building meeting May of 2010, was that right? And I waited and I waited. It was a very good meeting. It was a very interesting meeting, and it was at the end of a 2-day or 3-day meeting. The very last panel was on health. That was the one piece of health, that whole meeting. And I listened, and I appreciated the presentations, but I got up and said, coming from a clinician and a public health perspective, you know, architects, what it strikes me as what you're saying is the healthiest building is the absence of a building. And I know you need protection from the elements, but what's the best lighting? It mimics natural lighting, or it is natural lighting. What's the best air quality? Closer to outdoor air. What is the best view? The view of the natural world. So can't always do it with the problems we're trying to solve, but I think that many of the beautiful examples that have been shown today do that very well. And so thank you for doing that good work.
I'm from the South, so coming to the altar is kind of scary for me. Chris Long, NIH, down south. And a compliment to everyone here, Charles and everybody, for the spark to have this event, but also I was going to leave at 3 and drive home because I didn't want to get on 95 after it jammed up, and this was too good to leave, so you all are great. Thank you all very much. The tweet for, I guess it's Gail's tweet from earlier. We usually only integrate when we have to. Wow. I mean, I'm going to carry that out of here because it's true, you know, and we're busy, so we got to figure this building out, so we get all the people together. But this is a form of integration here, and so if there is an online forum or something like a gentleman mentioned earlier, that's great. Keep it up. Integrate all the time. And let's find incentives to share, because in a research environment we talk a lot about scientists hoarding their data because they want to get tenure. And some of the folks in the private industry here, you got something really cool, you don't want to share it with everybody because maybe you can make money on it, but we've got to find incentives for sharing. So let's share, let's integrate when we don't have to, and then all ships will rise together. And I guess the thing, my thought for the future is, yes, children are extremely important and they're sensitive. Let's make every building safe enough for a child to be in.
Come to the altar. Come to the altar.
Should I stand on the chair? My name is Polly Hoppin. I'm with the Lowell Center for Sustainable Production and faculty member at UMass, and it was a great day. I didn't leave early either. Thank you so much for it. We spend a lot of time thinking about large systems and how you might intervene in systems to achieve major shifts in those systems. So someone earlier said that there are 3 buckets or drivers that we were looking at today that were policies, practices, and investments. And since the investment word was mentioned, I've been churning around about what we might do with regard to the role of the investment side of things within this large system to really shift and drive toward green and healthy approaches at a much larger and accelerated scale. And so thinking about one constituency that I haven't heard mentioned today, although I wasn't here in the morning, so earlier in the morning it might have been mentioned, but that is the health insurance industry. And in the context of rising healthcare costs, increasing orientation toward prevention, someone mentioned the Affordable Care Act earlier, just thinking about ways to bring the health insurance industry to the table in an exploratory and preliminary way, but then to identify pilot projects that would be particularly opportune in terms of identifying reduced healthcare costs, the impact of green and healthy buildings on reduced healthcare costs. And I'm thinking to narrow that further, children who are suffering from obesity as well as asthma. As we all know, many of these kids that are particularly from low-income neighborhoods have multiple comorbidities, and so are going to benefit particularly from many aspects of green buildings, and the healthcare costs that could be saved by reducing their emergency rooms and their hospitalizations, or even by actually preventing some of these things to begin with, are particularly large in that population. So just thinking about pilot project opportunities in buildings that serve those kinds of kids, and remembering to measure the outcomes in those kinds of settings, and then beginning to get people who think about healthcare insurance as an investment in this kind of thing over time. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Chris Wabel with Clark Construction Group, and I want to first of all say thank you all so much for a really enriching day on a topic that I had no idea what I was getting into. And you might be sitting here thinking, what's a contractor doing standing up here? But I want to bring it back to what we discussed at the beginning of the day, which is this is all about improving the health of our occupants over the entire life cycle of a building. And I won't try and delve into the details of all of the strategies and design implementations that you seek to perform, because it wouldn't be in my practice. But I will say that I think something that came up frequently was that there's a significant communication gap and barrier that we find between researchers and designers. And I would like to point out that I think that really continues until this building hits the grave, from cradle to grave, from research to design to construction to finally occupancy of the building. These issues are going to be impactful. And I think I look around and these are all people who truly care about this topic, and that's wonderful. And it's now our job to go out and engage the people who might not exactly care or be aware. And so successfully marketing what we've discussed today and making incentives for those parties who are really critical to the built environment and critical to the successful implementation of these strategies is going to be truly impactful. And again, would like to thank you for allowing me to be one of those parties that didn't know so much before and now does. So thank you all.
Welcome to the corner. Well, I think today, this is Lorna Rosenberg. I think today, where's Michael Bloom? Is he still here? There he is. I think Michael challenged us with something that we often hear about in this business, which is singing from the same sheet of music. And he put up there something called an aria, right? So if we have the, what do you call it when a composer has a score a score for an aria, then we can move forward. And I would think that this organization, this Health and Buildings Roundtable, might use that rubric of aria to move forward, create awareness, to get response or feedback on the value, integration of what we do into practice and action. And then we will have the opportunity, if this organization can incorporate that and use those principles as an organizing framework, we can sing the song to the rest of the world.
Hi there, I'm Maria Papis with BBH Design. I'm our sustainability lead and also adjunct faculty at North Carolina State School of Architecture. And I think the two things that I'm taking away most today both have to do with communication. And that's first this idea of, yes, understanding and translating among ourselves, but also really focusing on how we talk to, as was just mentioned, those clients and folks who don't have this level of understanding. And the idea of storytelling really settled in with me, that everybody can relate to a story. Everyone knows sort of the morals of fairy tales, et cetera. And trying to really internalize that and figure out a way to relate these values in a way that makes sense to folks. And I think that also ties to a couple of the really good analogies that floated out today. Michael's analogy to marriage, I think was really appropriate, but also Russ's analogy to selecting building materials like you shop at the supermarket, and the idea of the perimeter versus the middle. And I think it's really those sorts of things that help us understand how we can talk to folks who have expertise in other areas or a very different level of understanding. And so that's what I really wanted to recognize, and I think moving forward, my hope is to figure out for myself and for everyone else ways to integrate this into education, and that ties to K through 12, of course, but also being in the collegiate setting. How do we start to talk to designers and other AAC education processes about material science and what we really need to know about that, and what's the interdisciplinary way to get that knowledge in so that folks coming out and into the profession understand what they need to be thinking about. Thank you for the great day.
Well, you know, this is appropriate because I'm sitting across the room from all of this. Paul Bertram, I'm the Director of Environment Sustainability with Kingspan Insulated Metal Panels, so I'm all about team integration and interdisciplinary teams to tackle this, but nobody, I mean, the contractor beat me to the table, right? So the manufacturers and our supply chains are where this is all really rooted, okay? We've got to be part of this discussion. And I was quite honestly a little disappointed that that perspective wasn't brought to the table today. So, you know, there's a lot of really good things going on out there, and I'm happy to say that with the work that we've done, we've eliminated a halogenated flame retardant. So, I mean, manufacturers can be the bad guys in a lot of people's eyes, but we are out there trying, and I think if you work with us and build the cases for us, there has to be a business case behind it, but I think I've heard that today, so thank you.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Wilson, National Center for Healthy Housing. And something that started off the day, and also something that Esther said at the end, Brian said and talked about the culture and changing that. And I think that it pointed out something that it really struck me is how all this is situational, in that we have to make a plan for whether you really want to change a giant system and culture, or whether you want to have an immediate impact on that $80,000 clinic that may not change everything you want to change, but it's making a step along the way. And I think that we all have to think about where do we want to be along that pathway. And Esther said that about research too. I come from this with a research background, is that there is basic research, there's a, you know, applied research, then there's translational research. And, you know, where do we want to be? And there needs to be room for all of it. And we can't just say there's one way. It's got to be a campaign. It's got to be something that we're looking at. A couple of nuggets for the thought process. A couple of things I've heard at one at a conference and one at on NPR actually. That there's a marketer in the energy efficiency field, Suzanne Shelton. I don't know if you've worked with her before, but she has a campaign called Change 5. And it's about changing 5 things in your home for energy efficiency. Because what she's found in her research is if you change 2 or 3, the consumer actually gets very frustrated because it doesn't change much about their bill. And they get very frustrated, and then they stop doing anything. There was a promise that you were going to change these energy efficient things, and my bill was going to go down, and it didn't, so I'm just done with you guys. And I think we have to be cautious about that, that we are not just providing enough nuggets that they do a couple of things and they don't do enough to really have an impact. And the other is, I can't remember his name, but the behavioral scientist on Morning Edition on NPR said a couple of weeks ago, talking about people giving for causes, and talked about when you give for, you know, if you give a nice example, a feel-good story, people are more likely to give than when they provide a lot of research behind it. The research actually turns people off. They start thinking about, oh my God, this problem is so big I can't do anything about it. So I think that we just have to be cautious about, we need more research, Actually, that little story that we tell may be more effective, and it's good to have the research in our back pocket, but let's be cautious there.
actually pretty good timing. Oh, please, one more. Go for it.
Yeah. Thanks. Just to reiterate a couple of things. I mean, my big picture things are Jim Whitehead, American College of Sports Medicine. That one of the things I'm impressed with is this is a movement in ascendancy. I mean, don't we get a sense of momentum and that more partners and more sectors and so forth? And when that is occurring, it's great. I think what history, just experience, probably common sense shows, you reach a stage of change where you need to try to align within that ascendancy. You need to try to make more of it than just what's actually occurring. And just a couple of things. The physical activity plan is a great opportunity. It certainly addresses the built environment. I mean, it understands that, but the textures here are so varied and I think present so many other opportunities. That's what needs to be infused within the physical activity plan. HiBR is another one of these things, that I'm just so pleased with the progress that has been made with it. Angela mentioned Active Earth, and we'll get some information to you about that. We had a meeting conference, collaborative conference that was also held in conjunction with the United Nations Assembly. Had the editor of the Lancet there, had acting Surgeon General, had the director of EPA, and it was all about looking at what are these co-benefits of active transportation, climate, economic development, that sort of thing. So you had these array of entities there, and it's great to have meetings, but you need to do more than that. They're a platform for something, and so I think what this presents is a grand opportunity. And then just a couple of other things I'll mention as examples of this ascendancy. There's a global movement that we're in partnership with Nike and 150 other organizations, or so-called Design to Move. And it's all about promoting physical activity, but it's also about the built environment. That's the second kind of area for that. That's a massive kind of a thing that needs to be linked in here so that you gain from it. And then there's Everybody Walk, and it could just go on and on. You all know these things. Okay, they're out there. The grand news is they're out there just kind of doing their own thing. The bad news is they're out there just doing their own thing, and that we really haven't kind of identified what, it's great, you salute them, you love them. It's wonderful that those things are going on. But isn't there some sort of common core that we can get together that adds power to what everybody is doing, and that we can identify maybe 2 or 3 things that we could do in common on massive scale? Well, and then just the last thing, so align a movement that's in ascendancy. I think that's fundamentally important, and I heard that so often here. The second is to develop and activate truly a social change blueprint, a movement, because all the elements of plan and communication and that sort of thing certainly would be part of it. But if you're really talking about social movement and historic change, guess what? You all know this. We're talking about complex, multi-professional, social and political factors here that are not going to be addressed by, quote, a campaign or by a message or by any of these things. It isn't kind of like, it's not affected by those things. It needs to be part of it, but it's not solved by it. So anyway, bottom line, I just think there are models for social change. We work with Clinton Health Matters, Clinton Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, all these entities, Aspen Institute, that try to drive change. There was a method to this and some elements for it, and I'd love for us to work together to begin to put that kind of thing, a kind of true organized multiplier effect, needle moving. You pick your metaphor for it, game changing, et cetera, because I think that's what we have within our grasp. We just need to take advantage. So align a movement in ascendancy, and secondly, develop and activate a social change blueprint.
Awesome. Okay, I get to close things off. So here's how this ends. So thank you guys for humoring that. Actually, we were exactly on time, which is fantastic. And so it's also a very long day. I appreciate you guys being down here in this protective space for a full day. And so here's a few things to finish off. So I think we have some refreshments outside. If folks are staying over in the area and would like to meet informally over dinner, we'll be meeting at Haleo's at 6 o'clock if you're looking for a group to have dinner with and continue some of these discussions. Otherwise, I wanted to let you know about 2 more events. So if you just can't get enough, and I would refer 2 things. One is, if you want to get more of that manufacturer's perspective on materials, I would recommend the YouTube channel that Dave Marcus has curated for us. We have been talking to folks throughout the year. This is event number 16. So, oh, that's a scary number. And we have 2 more to go, but before the end of the year. And those 2 events include, if you are really into bio-based materials, or you have friends who are into bio-based materials, and you are, it could happen, and so it could happen. December 3rd in Boston, they have friends in Boston or willing to travel to Boston to talk about bio-based materials. December 3rd at the EPA Region 1 office, we are partnering with UMass Lowell, Joel Tickner and his colleagues, and Ken Geisner to host an event in the same series focused more narrowly on innovation in products and innovations in building materials. And then back at our office, we're going to have faculty from GW University come and talk to us about rapid screening techniques, again, more for the material ingredient side. And that's going to be on December 15th, so you can end your academic year or end your professional year of thinking at USGBC with a free lunch or lunch on Google and a lecture on materials. So that's the first, the 3rd and the 15th. With that, thank you again. I just want to share a round of applause and appreciate you for sticking with us.